students, this is Mrs. T. Week 3, Lesson 3, we're talking about norms and sanctions that go along with them. So this is one of the big components of culture that we will review time and time again between today and the end of the semester. So pay attention, put your thinking caps on. Okay, so norms. This is a general overview of how you should write a definition for norms. Norms are social rules that exist. Sometimes those rules are written down, but most of the time those rules are just understood and learned over the course of our socialization process. So norms are rules about what our society or subgroup within society, subculture within society, finds to be acceptable, and also rules about the flip side. What does our subculture or what does our society find to be unacceptable behaviors, beliefs, or conditions? Okay? So, norms are social rules. There's an acceptable side, there's an unacceptable side, and therefore I have drawn this beautiful abstract picture here to try to give you a visual of how you can think about norms. So I have this timeline and kind of this circle that is bisected in the middle because on this side, everything on this side of center represents a range of behaviors that our society or a different society over there finds as unacceptable, things that we cannot do. On this side of the general center of this circle is a big range or a big area that has all of the different behaviors within it that our society finds acceptable or appropriate. You are allowed to do those behaviors, so to speak. But this general fat line that I have down the middle of this circle, I have a question mark for this area that I've kind of colored in, the gray area, so to speak, because our culture does not necessarily include within it every single human behavior that is possible. So we haven't tried all of the behaviors in our culture to see whether it would be acceptable or whether it's unacceptable in our society. So, let's think about how do we know where these lines are, because and how wide the line is, right? Because I've got it kind of wide in this general area around this line. It's kind of a wide gap between the unacceptable side and the acceptable side. So, norms are social rules, but we learn them as we go. How do we learn whether a behavior is acceptable or not acceptable? Well, that's where the word sanctions or the concept of sanctions comes in. Sanctions are punishments or rewards for behavior that's done. So it's easiest, in my opinion, to understand norms and sanctions and how we begin to categorize our behaviors into acceptable or unacceptable if we start with little kids. So little kids, like we've said in previous videos, we are all born knowing nothing. We have to learn everything from the context of our life experience and what goes on in our daily lives. I remember my nephew was born and it took him a long time. He was kind of old, 3 or 4, before he really got the concept that naked was not a thing that people could be in public. Like he would just run off down the street with no pants on, and that's an unacceptable way of being. But that's my point here. That's a part of our culture that we learn. In all parts of our culture we learn, but that's a simple thing that you and I take for granted, that clothing is required in public, but babies don't know that. We have to teach them over time. So, because he got sanctioned, a punishment in this case, what we call a negative sanction, enough times for running out in the front yard without his pants on, eventually he began to realize and start to practice the acceptable behavior of putting his pants on before he went outside, right? So, or blowing your nose, that was another big one. He had a hard time with learning how to blow his nose properly, and there's a complex ritual, really, that we have around the acceptable way to blow your nose in this society. I mean, your sleeve works, and your shirt works, and your hair even works if it wraps around that far. Just blowing it into the distance works, but those are not acceptable behaviors. I'm sorry, those are over here. You know how I know? Sanctions. Rewards or punishments for trying a behavior and then finding out by the reaction of those around us whether it's acceptable or unacceptable behavior. So in other words, when we're little, this gray area is really, really wide. And as we get older, and I'm not saying much older, it starts really, really early on. As we get older and start acting out our own behaviors based on what we see and know around us, this gap gets narrower and narrower, and we learn what's unacceptable in our society. Blowing our nose in our hair is unacceptable in our society, and what is acceptable in our society, using a Kleenex that is throwaway, right? So, as we are older and we know more and more about our culture, more and more about our behaviors, this gap gets closer together. However, there are still plenty of behaviors, ideas, beliefs, conditions that exist in human culture worldwide that aren't necessarily, let me start again, that aren't necessarily or haven't necessarily been considered for inclusion in our society. That was an ugly sentence, but what I mean is, well, let me start with an example. We have to eat, right? That's part of our culture, part of any culture. It's a cultural universal. You have to eat. There's a lot of culinary students in this class. However, what is defined as edible is different from one society to the next. There are many societies that include insects in their food, and I don't mean that they are included in their food because they have invaded and you have to find an exterminator. I mean you make tacos out of them, you make chocolate chip cookies out of them. They are what's for dinner. Other societies eat horses, for instance. There's a lot of meat on a horse. We have poverty and food insecurity in our society, but our society tends to find it unacceptable in general to eat horse meat, whereas countries in Europe, Italy comes to mind, Austria comes to mind, eating horses and donkeys is not extremely common, but throughout history they've always done it, so you're also not going to get any kind of major negative sanction should you do that. A friend of mine is from Japan. They eat horse in Japan also. Some of you right now are having a very negative response to me telling you about this because your noses are wrinkled up, you're doing all kinds of facial expressions and gestures that go along with the communication that we talked about in the previous lecture. But these kinds of reactions that you're having are because we don't even consider behaviors in this gray area as part of our culture, and that's what is in the gray area, right? We won't know whether eating horse meat, for instance, is eventually accepted in our society or remains unacceptable in our society until we try to include it in our regular daily habits, customs, traditions, and part of our culture. We would know from sanctions that we get, whether they are individual sanctions, positive or negative, that we get from a neighbor. We're having a cookout, we're having horse, come on over, nobody shows. There's a negative sanction that we would know, okay, this is not acceptable. Or whether, authorities from the government come to say we're doing cruelty to animals or some kind of thing. In which case I would have to ask them about what was wrong with the cow. Why wasn't there anything wrong with the cow the week before? There's a really kind of gray area line between what our society defines as edible, what we believe we can and should and do eat, and what we can and shouldn't and don't eat. So Norms are rules about what's acceptable and unacceptable in a society. How do we know where the line is between the unacceptability and the acceptability? We measure and gauge sanctions, which are reactions to behavior. There are negative sanctions that are built to, or reactions designed to deter or make you think twice before you do another behavior. And there are positive sanctions, which are designed to reinforce behavior that you would like repeated. So have a look in your textbook about this topic, maybe look up some other videos online, and actually our next short video that we have together, we're going to look into norms more deeply, because there are 3 types of norms that we need to focus on in class, and so we're going to itemize those in our next lecture together, and I'll see you then. Text me with questions. Bye.